Good morning.
Morning. As mentioned, let me be clear, I do not represent the DoD. I'm a retired Army officer. I was an environmental science and engineering officer for almost 22 years, and my intent here is to try to enlighten individuals on what the data collection processes out there are and what the challenges are. So as you move forward with your research, you might better understand what the situation is. So my situation, as I said, former Force Health Protection officer. The slide deck that I'm going to show you today is focused on my time in Afghanistan from 08 to 09. Some of you might already be working with cohorts from there now. There was approximately 127 locations in Afghanistan with U.S. forces on it during that time frame. This was the time frame right as the surge was beginning in Afghanistan. The population increased by approximately 100,000 troops towards that period in 09. I was on an assistance team for the command group, and I was at command group headquarters. So I was able to travel a little bit easier than a lot of other individuals in the nation. Made it to approximately 100 locations in that time frame, so we were able to help the staff improve the situation for those soldiers and maintain our combat power. A lot of challenges here. Some of them I'll go into more in depth. The mixed threats. It's very rare that it's a simple situation where one person huffed a whole bunch of pesticides. That's an acute exposure that's going to present quickly, and people are going to understand what it is almost immediately. You also have to understand with the data challenges, the challenges with security requirements. Commands are not going to give detailed locations of grid coordinates for everybody in many instances because it's a security issue. Putting wireless monitors on everyone in the battle space that's transmitting their Fitbit data up so somebody can pull it all down on Google Maps, that's a security problem. So as you think about paths forward in some cases, keep that in mind. There are security requirements that the commanders are just not going to allow you to do. The weight for the individuals. Ounces get heavily fought over. So somebody says, oh, well, hey, in the industrial setting, everybody just wears this little monitor on their hip, and it only weighs 5 ounces. Well, yeah, that's great for an 8-hour shift when you're not wearing anything but standard business attire. When you already got body armor on and a 100-pound ruck on your back, that extra 5 ounces is, no, it's almost a non-starter. It's very tough to get the combatant commander to say, yeah, sure, let's strap this on there. And the next question out of their mouth will be, so what? Is this increasing my lethality? Is this increasing my ability to fight today? They care about their soldiers, sailors, airmen. I'm an Army guy, so sorry for the Army references. But if it's going to add weight and slow them down today, they're going to be resistant to it. The data that's out there, not always in full gear, and that's another thing. So if somebody says we're going to put it on their body armor, well, they may only have that body armor on for 6 hours a day. Or we're going to put it on their helmet. Well, their helmet may not be on. So please don't make the assumptions that they're living in this set of equipment, because they're not. There were some individuals who just seemed to live in their workout attire because they were staff folks on the forward operating base. So they never wore that whole battle rattle that you always see in all the cool guy and gal pictures out there. So again, don't make the assumption that something on their helmet is going to be on their individual 24/7. People sleep a couple hours a night, and they're not going to be wearing all of that kit. So the collection of the data, there was approximately 20 people working this effort in Afghanistan when I was there. And Afghanistan's approximately the size of California. We were pushing probably 100,000 troops towards the end. So you have very limited staff. Think about 20 people to cover California. And these are rough estimates. brigade combat team is approximately 5,000 people. They will have one junior officer assigned to that brigade combat team, who's a junior environmental science and engineering officer. That person has a hard science degree or an engineering degree. They often will have been to the Army Preventive Medicine course prior to deployment, but not always. So we train them the best we can, and we send them out there to cover that 5,000 person force, which will be spread over the size of a state. It's very, very tough for them to move around. It's very tough for them to stay focused on this. And they're 23, 24 years old, trying to cover this entire unit in contact, in combat, in a hostile environment. They're not necessarily public health professionals. They haven't gotten to that point in their career yet. And they have a junior enlisted person with them. So it's them and a junior enlisted folk. They're assigned to the medical company, and sometimes there are other duties assigned. And, oh, by the way, that individual is also responsible for safe food and water for that command and the broader public health spectrum, not only the environmental health mission. So when there's foodborne outbreaks, if there's a problem with water, they're also focusing on that. And that's going to be taking a lot of their time away. The databases that are out there, they depend upon the data that goes into them. So I'm sure a lot of you are probably familiar with DOORS already. You need the data collection done in the field to be able to feed those systems for them to be able to perform. And that's probably the biggest challenge right now, is that data collection out in the field. The post-deployment health risk assessments. This is an individual reporting when they get done, this is what happened to me. Well, our command was on a 15-month tour. I would be very skeptical of anybody being able to sum up their 15-month experience. And this is being done 30 days roughly when they get back. What were you exposed to? And again, if we can't speak with real confidence what that individual is exposed to at a senior level. I mean, if I asked any of you what you were exposed to 6 months ago, maybe you went to the dry cleaners. Dry cleaners smelled bad that day. Maybe they had a solvent leak in the back. Are you going to remember that? So to ask a young individual who is rather ignorant of this space, they're not stupid, but they don't really understand the environmental occupational world and the threats that are around them, to ask them 6 months, a year after something happened to them, it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. And then there are certain organizations who, if they report on that, and this is the National Guard soldiers, they will be kept at that CONUS replacement station until their medical threats are addressed, which means they're not going home. And they may have already been gone from their home of record. They may have been gone for a year and a half at that point in time, because the National Guard has a train up before they do their deployment, and then they redeploy. So when the word spreads among a unit like that, that if you check anything on here, you're going to be held at Fort Gordon, or not, one of the CONUS replacement centers, they are very recalcitrant. Again, you're talking a young individual who wants to go home to their spouse and move on with their life. Now, that's not a dig on the Department of Defense. They're really trying to take care of that individual so that they can address these things before they go back home to their civilian job, because then they're out of the DoD support structure. And they're doing the absolute best that they can, but it puts that young individual into a quandary. So if you go looking at a lot of the PDHRAs, just understand that there's recollection bias and a lot of things that fall into that. Force structure, there's currently 8 preventive medicine detachments on active duty within the Army. So you start to think, if you got 8 and you want 2 in theater, you start to run out of units pretty quick, because you need one training up to be there to replace the one that's there, and the one just got back, so they're not deployable currently, because they got to get reset and have time back home. And that's a core level asset. That's a unit of approximately 12 people, 3 4-man teams. That 12 people, again, just to give you a number, That's a limited resource. There's only so many people, and they get spread thin very quickly. At the division, which is where I was for Afghanistan, there's one field grade officer at division staff. No NCO, no non-commissioned officer, so you don't have that enlisted support channel. And you stay very busy trying to support the staff operations, and in my case, doing the battlefield circulation to be able to do as much as possible. Brigade Combat Team, I already mentioned, that's one company grade officer, and they have a very, very challenging job. Division, you're talking 4 brigade combat teams, so that's, depending on the unit, that's roughly 10,000 to 20,000 people. When you deploy in the division headquarters is the headquarters for the country, then you're talking to 30,000 to 100,000, depending on what the force structure is for that location. Special Forces groups are another challenging thing all among themselves. That's another company grade officer assigned there. So this is someone, sorry for those without a military background, someone with 5 to 10 years experience working in this occupation. And they have a non-commissioned officer, so they have a sergeant with them. But a Special Forces group, they tend to deploy in 12-man teams, and they may be deployed on 3 or 4 different continents at any point in time. So trying to provide surveillance for them spread all over the world, when you're 2 people, they have unique challenges in amongst themselves. So the burn pits, and there's several photographs in here. I know it gets discussed a lot, and I don't want to drag the point too far, but for those, I don't know how many people have actually seen what anyone is talking about. There's the famous picture of the Air Force enlisted individual throwing uniforms in the one in Iraq. I can't speak to that one. I can speak to this one because it was one of the many that we dealt with. And so the challenges here, and as I mentioned earlier, the mixed challenges. So you have regulated medical waste that's been thrown in here. This is also the way you got rid of your atropine auto injectors for your nuclear, biological, chemical treatment when you were done. Tons of batteries. The commands quite often burned the batteries because they were very afraid of the insurgents getting them and using them for IEDs. So they did a risk assessment, and they were concerned more about that kinetic threat of it blowing up their soldiers tonight than the long-term health effects. These are all, and all the black items are also batteries also. Those are the larger ones that come out of a different weapon system. All the green ones are usually out of commo equipment. So you got regulated medical waste there. There's a sharps container, several of the batteries in a plastic case. Then those are lithium-ion batteries, so lithium, zinc, nickel, cadmium, several heavy metals. All those sandbags, and I don't know why they would throw sandbags into a burn pit, but then you have the plastic from the sandbags, and I don't know if the sandbags were treated for something. I mean, were they treated with a water repellent? Were they treated with, I have no idea, because I don't know what the mil spec on a sandbag is. And then you slowly smolder these items for days, weeks, months. You get a very interesting mixture that's going to potentially come out of that. Another one, because again, I saw over 100 of these. The point of this one is no 2 are the same. So if you have this concept in your head that this is a well-regulated, planned thing, it's not. There is a Corps of Engineering manual on how to properly build a burn pit, and that gives you a chimney effect, which gets the smoke up higher off of the population, and you get a more complete burn if you do it that way. Most of these were shallow areas where the command was, where it was convenient for them to put their trash and to try to get rid of it. So, you know, and a lot of it was food waste. So then you have all the feral animals that come in with the food waste. This one was quite interesting. This goes over 1 kilometer. I could not understand or get an answer from anybody in the command group of what their thought process was here. It runs all the way to the ridge line you see in the back. And now this positive note, this was off of the compound, so at least the individuals were not constantly exposed to the fumes coming off of this. I could not get any type of a reasonable explanation, though, of what was their thought process here. Additional ones, and this is to show the one on the left, that's within the compound, and quite often they were within the compound. Sometimes they would be in the middle of the compound because they were concerned about the security risk. But if you put it in the middle of the compound, then someone is being exposed to that off-gassing smoke 24/7, because no matter how the wind blows, somebody is being affected by that. So advantages of being off the compound. Of course, you got challenges if it's on. The one to the right is actually burning some, and you can't see it, but they often throw, I don't know if I have a laser pointer or not. This wire here is the wire from these HESCO baskets. So the HESCO barriers are what you fill full of dirt and rocks to form the perimeter around your compound. I don't know if anyone's looked into what are those treated with, coated with. The wire is galvanized wire. So that has a metal treatment placed on it to keep it from rusting. I believe zinc predominantly. So what happens when you smolder a ton of galvanized wire with the plastic and the batteries and everything else? And I can never get a straight answer from anybody about why are you throwing wire in the pit? You can't burn that. You can't burn cans. So a lot of it could have been better managed. And then just a slow smolder on the right one. There's a guard tower in the distance, which puts them at a good height to be exposed to that smoke, depending on which way it's blowing. A close-up of the batteries so you can see what actually is in that battery pack. It's actually something that looks more like D-cell batteries that are wired together in that plastic core. And then the plastic bottle on the left. Food waste, you just kept throwing it in there, adding a little bit of compound to try to get it to burn. And again, I think it's a very challenging situation that you're facing if you're trying to characterize what's coming off of these burn pits. Well, you mixed it all together, burned it at a low level temperature. What do you have? The one on the left, that's the doorway of the compound. So they were just throwing the items, in this case, right out the back of the compound. And when the wind blew just right, it just sucked it in, chimney effect, into the compound. Another one on the right-hand side. At least this one's not adjacent to your structure, but that is in the compound again. Then the other things that you have to take into account, the dust, and a lot of the dust is probably not going to get deep into someone's lungs. I understand that. The picture on the left, this is one compound though. It was fine dust. It was like being on the moon, and everyone looked like a powdered donut. And it wasn't that they were unsanitary or that they weren't trying to do right, but you sweat just a little bit, and the dust on this location was very, very unique. And as you see, it looks like a moon footprint. Very, very fine, and that's got to be impacting the upper respiratory system, if not the entire thing. Diesel particulates. This is constantly a challenge because all the power provided in these installations is provided by diesel generators. And there's a large, when you start to think about the larger installations over there, it's a plant bigger than this room of diesel generators that are running 24/7, 365, and all the vehicles that are predominantly diesel just idling. If they're setting on the perimeter, they may need to be kept running in order to keep the weapon systems hot. A lot of diesel particulates that are coming off. And then you have things with the burning sewage in the bottom right corner there. You have to understand a lot of this is in a very, very austere environment. People think, yes, you have the large airfields, which quality of life is pretty good at, but you get out to the smaller installations, the smaller combat outposts. I mean, those are burnout latrines. So every couple days, somebody has to go out and set fire to the sewage. We actually had 2 soldiers who set fire to themselves while doing this because no one wants to stand out there and stir that for 6 or 8 hours. So they get some accelerants. You're supposed to use diesel fuel. So they get some gasoline in order to get it to go faster. Or if they can, they will get mortar propellant, because the mortar propellant burns very, very hot. So now you've introduced an explosive into this that you're burning. It does not explode, mind you, it just burns hot. But obviously particulates coming off of that. I'm not concerned about the burning sewage, just again let you know that there's another thing out there. And an individual stands there with a metal stake and stirs this for quite a period of time. You have the disease that's endemic to these deployed settings. You have the food and water issues. The water setting into bottles, and I believe this has been pretty well studied, but you have the water setting in plastic bottles out in the sun for weeks or months. I think that's been addressed. The food, the U.S. Army does a pretty good job of getting them, I'd say a very good job, in supporting these operations in austere environments. And I'll talk about personal choices in a slide or two, because people don't always do the smartest stuff. The explosives, because you do have people that might opt to burn the sewage with a small explosive charge. The weapon systems that are being used, the combustion byproducts from small arms fire, larger explosions that are going off. You can throw all that into the mix. Violence not really germane to this one. Fuel vapor exposure. So the blivet you see here with the water around it, this is a large fuel blivet. So this was this location's fuel point. This stain that doesn't entirely show very well is a large fuel stain that's been there and it's been ongoing, seeping into the ground. This building is the well pump for their well water. We had several instances where the groundwater got contaminated by a situation like this. Underground storage tank or fuel blivet would rupture, and then the people are this is what's running all your shower facilities, and then you would end up with a diesel smell in the shower facility. So we rectified it as fast as we could, but it would obviously take time to move wellheads. So that's something else to keep in mind. Plus all the fuel handling. The people have got to run these generators. They've got to refuel their vehicles. There are people whose actual job in the military is to be a fuel handler. They're exposed heavily to fuel products in their day-to-day routine. Their uniforms end up being contaminated. Obviously, laundry facilities in these locations are very limited. You're washing something in a bucket by hand, and so it's obviously tough to get all those fuel products out of your uniform. Personal decisions, which this is one that's hard to go after sometimes, hard to address. The pictures to the right, the locals that would work on the installations, this is the way they would cook quite often. So they're cooking right on the perimeter wall or a building that's occupied or that they're doing work on. So trying to quantify this. Now, it's a smaller risk, but just to throw it into the mix. This larger personal decision issue, so these units are trying to provide for the people the best they can. They get a 55-gallon drum of unknown origin with unknown contents in it before they decide to turn it into a barbecue grill. They take that galvanized wire that I mentioned earlier, and that's what the cooking grate is. And then this wood is pressure-treated lumber that came from China that was treated with formaldehyde and arsenic. So that's what they're going to cook the food that they can acquire. So you have a painted drum of unknown origin, galvanized metal, and pressure-treated lumber that you're going to cook a wild game bird on that you get somewhere, or the hamburgers that you provided through the supply system. I trying to quantify that would be a challenge, I believe. And again, it's not that these people are trying to do the wrong thing. They're really trying to do the right thing for their individuals in a tough environment. It's 4th of July. Pick your date. Having a barbecue makes everybody feel a little bit better. And given the limited resources they have, they're doing the best that they could. But, and again, the average American, people think it's a good idea to go to a gas station and buy an unlabeled vape container and vape it today. So, people make interesting decisions at points. So, kind of to wrap it all up, touch on things I might have missed. It's a very tough mission space. You have to understand this is not in the United States. This is not a defined parameter. If you're in an industrial setting, I can go get your MSDS book that's mandated by law, and I can go through and I know exactly what is in your facility. And then I can purchase the 6 monitors that I need to identify the threats that are in your facility. And everybody has the right to read the MSDS. You get into this environment, it's just not there. So people just don't know. So there's many unknowns. Extended time periods. You're not talking an OSHA 8-hour time period. These people were there for 9 months, 12 months, 15 months, and they never leave. You don't get away from these pollutants. There's nowhere to go. The mixtures that I hit on several times, trying to characterize that is tough. And mind you, you could characterize one location and it varied. Maybe that command was very good in backhauling their batteries, so maybe there were no batteries in their burn pit. The other ones might have had a plethora of them. Personal decisions, that's an outlier in some cases, but you just need to know it's there. Dose. My industrial hygiene partners always beat me up. Dose. We need dose. I would love nothing more to be able to look at that veteran today and tell them what dose they received of what. But start to think about what it takes to get to a dose, and that's an extremely, extremely challenging situation. Then I mentioned earlier, it's limited personnel. So again, if you start to think for your solutions, one person to cover down on 5,000. So if you propose something that someone needs to go pull that piece of paper or that filter off every individual every 24 hours, think what's the process for this? The data challenges I mentioned earlier, but well, the who and where and the when. You sometimes will find that there'll be an identifier that someone's unit, by their unit identification code, was at this location. Be careful in extrapolating that to mean that individual is at that location. It's a good surrogate and it's a great start point. But there are times where that company command was there, but the platoon may have been 20 miles east or west on a different combat outpost. In my instance, my UIC would have had me on Bagram, but I was gone for 9 months of the 13 I was there. So if you use Bagram as my exposure situation, you would be about 2/3 off because of the mission that I was conducting. Also, when folks move around, so it's tough. And then what do you do with the data that is collected? And there are systems out there, but you need to understand the limitations and capabilities of those systems. The where, pull that thread for a second, the commands change the names of these outposts frequently. Camu became Keating, became Lau in a matter of about 9 months. So that is one outpost that changed names 3 times. So some VA rep asked a soldier, where were you? And they say Camu. They may not even find it in the system because that name has changed that many times. And you can't expect this individual to remember 5 years ago the grid coordinate for where they were. So that's a challenge within the data. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the security. People are going to be very recalcitrant. The command forces are going to be very recalcitrant to blasting out the grid coordinates for where everybody is. That's bad operational security. I understand that it would certainly make the environmental occupational people's jobs easier if everybody had a Fitbit beaming data up 24/7 to the cloud, but understand the issues that are there. You have my contact info. I'll be around here for the remainder of the day. Happy to answer any questions anybody has. All I got.
So thank you. Very interesting discussion of the problems in trying to collect information on exposures and dose concentration, et cetera. So we've heard all the downsides of trying to do this. If you were tasked with what could be done, recognizing your experience, which is obviously very, very important to this, do you see any fixes based on your experience? I mean, obviously you don't want to put any weight on individuals. Well, what would you suggest, given your background?
One of the things that hurts the community right now is people want perfection, and good is the enemy, or good's the enemy of perfect, however that saying is. I think you need to start with area monitoring. You need to understand, and none of these are perfect. So you do area monitoring, and you're going to probably get an accurate picture of 80 or 90% of the people that are deployed then. Now, I understand there'll be that platoon that ends up on an outpost somewhere, and maybe you lose track of them. But you do the large installations, and you do them well. Then as you have the capacity, you move to the smaller ones that maybe have 400 people on them instead of 4,000. And Dr. Therenkorn will brief some of the stuff that we've been doing at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. Silicone bracelets that I'm sure some of you have seen the research on in the past. I'm a big proponent of that because we had unique exposures in Afghanistan. Formaldehyde's the one that I always bring up. No one knew, why would soldiers in a remote camp have formaldehyde? Where'd they get that at? It was from the Chinese lumber that had been imported to build the little huts that they lived in. So this exposure went on for an extended period of time because no one thought, why would you go looking for formaldehyde? I wouldn't. But if somebody would have, if we'd had the silicone bracelets sent into theater, and you could send one to every little wide spot, you could send it to that very small unit. Send them back, after a week, after a month. Then you analyze it, and you have 3 outliers. Why is this there? Why does this one installation have an issue with acetone, or pick your item? Then you could send a professional there to track that down and mitigate that threat now, rather than trying to do a retrospective study 10 years later. So the area monitoring, which could be done now in a limited capacity, the silicone bracelets, there are things that could be done. They have limitations, and I'll readily admit that. And I'd be open to anything else that anyone else in the community has. But I think we need to do something rather than waiting for the perfect Spock tricorder.
Good. Questions from committee? Meredith.
Hi. Very nice talk and a lot of great information. I have a few questions. I'm just curious, thinking retrospectively, was there any, I don't know of a good way to put it, maybe mapping or location noting of where specific sources were located within a base? And is that information, was it routinely done, or was it done at all, or is there any information on that to look at retrospective?
Like where's the burn pit within that installation? Yes, that should be out there. There are OHISs and poems. There's assessments that are done for those camps. So they may sometimes become dated, though, because a new organization comes in, or for instance, what was there before the surge, after the surge, and then what is there today, because some of them are gone. Some of them may be reoccupied 5 years after the fact. So you have to be a little bit careful, because they may have filled in the burn pit and put it somewhere else 5 years later when they occupied it again. Then it's a little bit on what individual did that and their level of detail. Because some of these camps are roughly the size of a football field. So the individual who did that may have not gone to the burn pit and recorded the grid coordinate for that. Because they're like, it's the size of a football field. You can see, So they may have just kind of let that go. And whereas the larger ones, I would expect, but again, it depends on the level of detail of the individual who did that. I would expect that they would have put where the burn pits were.
And were those records systematically entered somewhere?
It should all end up in the doors system. And you do get some challenges, though, with the grid coordinates that are in those systems and working to get access to that information. So it should be in the doors system. I've not worked with that in several years, though, so I don't want to speak out of line.
Other questions, Frank?
If we sort of thought about the brigade level, the 5,000 people, do you think that it's possible that among that 5,000 people, by their various titles, from whether you use private to general, maybe there's no general there, but whatever, or the sort of specific title they might have as a field officer or whatever it is, that you could identify subgroups of people who either had limited exposure, high exposure, or no exposure in a given site. Very rough.
I don't think so. And the reason I say that, and again, anecdotal small sample size, we had a young man who, if you'd have gone by his rank, he was a PFC, so you would think private first class, he's out doing combat maneuvers and operations. He ran the laundry point. So he never left that installation. I tried to get him on some things outside of the wire. He never left the installation. If you look at injuries, cooks and truck drivers had a very high injury rate when you thought cooks and truck drivers. Well, it's because the cooks had a lot of their jobs contracted out. So the cooks got put on driving missions and were being hit by IEDs or by small arms fire in convoys. So to go, if you went by their job title, cook, you're thinking, well, they're in a pretty safe place, protected. Well, no, they're on the convoys because we contracted that function out. And the same for the truck drivers. You might think, well, they're not in combat operations, so they're relatively safe, but they were taking a pretty high casualty rate by the convoys. So I think that would be a very, very tough thing to do. You could possibly pull the thread and say certain units, artillerymen, well, no, even artillerymen, because we took the guns away from lots of artillerymen and made them infantrymen. I was going to say you could say that they were exposed to more combustion byproducts from the firing of their weapon systems, but not if you took that. There were times that stayed home in the States and they were given a small rifle and they did that mission. So I think it'd be very tough. I think it would be tough.
Anything else, Cecile?
Thanks for that. I wonder if you could comment on things like seasonal variability in terms of exposures. One of the things that I've heard from some of the patients I've seen in clinic is that during very cold seasons or in cold locations, they will often stay next to the diesel generators or to the equipment because they stay warmer. And I wonder also if you could tell us a little bit more about where the pesticide exposures occur.
So the temperature, the biggest meteorological thing I can think of is the inversions that would happen. A lot of these, Bagram, for instance, and Salerno, Sharon, a lot of these are kind of in a bowl. So when you get that meteorological inversion, it would just fill with contaminants. Some from the local population, which is yet something else you need to think about. The local populations are burning yet other odd things. But so when you get, and cities in America have the same inversion impact at times. So you get the inversion effect in instances. What people would do in the cold to try to stay warm, that kind of comes back to that personal decision. You get carbon monoxide poisoning from people running their vehicles extended periods of time improperly. So I think that would be. I think as far as large scale cold implications, I don't know of any readily. Sometimes if they're burning the old diesel stoves in their command headquarters, there's diesel stoves within the supply system that it's burning diesel, kind of like a kerosene heater, except the military version of it. So you do have that issue. The pesticide exposures, you had contractors who were predominantly in charge of the pesticide operations. However, they would not go to certain locations. There was a security protocol that allowed them to only go to X number of locations. Then, ideally, your preventive medicine people, roughly the 20 I mentioned that are there, would go out and do pesticide operations as needed. They're working on a system to update those records. To the best of my knowledge, that's all still paper records that's out there. And if it was the contractors, and I had oversight for the pesticide operations contract, I had very high confidence in what they were doing. When you got outside of the contractor purview, then you had people who may have had a little bit less capability. Or you may have even had local nationals or third-party nationals who were doing that work at those remote locations.
What were the pesticides and the pests you were?
A lot of times it's going after vector-bearing things. Malaria control is quite often the 50-meter target that the military tends to care about is mosquitoes, because in Afghanistan you did have some falciparum malaria risk. So you were trying to do mosquito control predominantly.
So we're going to take two final quick questions from Meredith and Meredith.
Thanks for your presentation. You provided a lot of really informative details, and recognizing that some of what I'm going to ask you is about anecdotal information, but two questions. One is just when you were doing this work and looking at burn pits and assessing these types of things, could you comment on any information that you got about level of concern about respiratory health effects, and whether those were something that was a concern among many or kind of specific groups? And the other question I wanted to ask was, you gave some good examples of personal behaviors that aren't always great choices, but did you find any anecdotes or information about choices that were potentially productive or adaptive behaviors that people were implementing based on respiratory effects of burning?
I didn't hear. I mean, there would be a few. They'd be the outliers, honestly. And I had a few people that the one large compound that the burn pit was in the middle. We had a few vocal people, and they may have simply been those sentinel cases who were complaining. I'm coughing all the time. I'm hacking up black stuff. You know, because their living structure was next to this, so however many hours they're spending in there, they're inhaling these things. So you had those early sentinel cases that would present to the healthcare community, but it wasn't that often. The one burn pit I showed you the picture of, that battalion's command sergeant major's son died within 48 hours of getting to theater. So that unit had a very, very different mindset, and they were about getting through those 15 months. And it was a very hardened, capable unit, very impressive unit. So when you talk to someone who's flown their child home, their thought process is not what's going to happen to me and my guys in 10 years. And when you're trying to bring this up and you're sitting in a small room and the walls are lined with the deceased pictures, you know, you fight the good fight and you try to get them to understand you got to stop burning these batteries. You got to, you know, this is stuff that is down the road in their minds. They're looking about getting home. So it's a tough fight, and that's why we need to find things that remove this, in my opinion, from the person. Because if you say you got to wear this device, hey, if it slows me down in the next firefight, I'm not wearing it. So we got to find some things that take it back a step that can be handled. And I'm sorry, was there?
Oh, it was about just adaptive behaviors in response.
Very, very little. Honestly, there wasn't much that they could do. Put on a particulate mask if they were inclined, but at the remote locations, there really wasn't much. Really wasn't much that an individual could do.
Meredith.
Okay. You mentioned area exposures, that you would recommend that. Do you think that it would be, things have changed since you were there? Do you think if we were to recommend area monitoring now, that would reflect in any way, or we could strategically do this in order to capture what may have happened before? Or do you think there's other ways that we could retrospectively examine exposures?
I think there's some potential with satellite imagery to go back and look. Potential. Because I've talked to some of my space counterparts at the lab. They eliminate all the atmospherics because they want to see what they want to see. So they're pretty good at identifying the noise to them and seeing what's there. Now, you would probably get surrogates for things. You wouldn't necessarily get a specific compound if that's what you're looking for. So I think the remote sensing is worth pulling the thread on more than the community has. If you went in with area samplers now, I would be very reluctant to say that that's anywhere accurate to that 10-year-old sample. Whereas again, with the satellite imagery, or maybe you simply do the weather imagery, you could tell if there was an inversion for X number of weeks or days or months out of that year, and get some information there. But to say that today is 10 years ago, because there's going to be new things introduced and things that have been properly eliminated. So I would be reluctant to make that extrapolation.
Thank you. Very informative, and I'm sure will be very useful and helpful to the committee.